A lot is happening across the continent, Nigeria inclusive. Just as Nigerians have tried to tweak the Electoral Act in South Africa, the conversation regarding the Electoral Act is getting wider. And of course, it's been tried, it's been pushed. The conversation is something that we'll be looking at. A strong electoral system is the aim, and this is what we'll be looking at on The Square. Welcome to The Square. I'm Sulaiman. In June 2020, the Constitutional Court in South Africa declared the country's Electoral Act unconstitutional, as it does not allow independent candidates to contest at national and provincial levels, so preventing people who do not wish to belong to political parties from contesting elections. Now, the new proposed electoral amendment bill will now be debated and voted on in the National Assembly on Thursday, and that's tomorrow, October 20. Yes, and of course, the bill came about following a High Court decision that it must be reviewed to allow independent candidates to stand without being affiliated to political parties. The bill has been criticized by civil society organizations who have accused the Parliament of placing the 2024 general elections at risk with a proposed electoral amendment bill. So various organizations have launched an electoral reform campaign against the electoral reform bill, in which they argued that the bill was unfair and would cause some kind of disadvantage to independent candidates if passed into law. Will this bill survive the challenge and will it be enacted? Well, first, I have Kemini with me here in the studios. Kemini, good to see you again, and thanks for your time as always, because I did say Kemini is taken over.
Well, at some point, yes.
I'm winding down on The Square.
So and I really look forward to carrying it to, the next step where you probably would have if you had stayed on. But like you said the last time, right? You're not leaving it hands off. You still be around, make cameos every now and then,
in
right?
Spirit.
In spirit? That's not enough.
Well, Jenny knows that on this conversation are Duduetsang Mmeti, who is the communications officer, Defend Our Democracy, and Professor Dirk Kotze. He is a professor in political sciences at the University of South Africa in Pretoria. Good to have you both join us on The Square. Now, let's start by asking Professor, this bill is getting the attention that it needs. First, we saw how much of a concern it's been among the political class. Now, South Africans all across the divide are speaking about this. Tell us, how important is this bill for South Africans?
Well, I think for many voters in South Africa, it is very important because there's a feeling that the current system in South Africa, which is a proportional representation system, and therefore it's primarily and exclusively based on the support that political parties receive in the national and the provincial elections, that is not sufficiently representative, especially from the point of view of accountability. That it's mainly parties that determine the candidates and not individual voters that can be involved in it. And then at the same time, there's not individual representatives that the voters or the citizens or the residents can go directly to and say, well, please represent us in Parliament on this particular matter. They also don't account for to what extent the mandates that were given to the political parties at the different elections, that they have been implemented by the governing parties. So there's a general feeling that this system is too much dominated by political parties, and individual representation or representation for more specific constituencies is absent from this system. And that was what the Constitutional Court in two years ago agreed with, to say that in terms of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, each person who is eligible in South Africa must be able to stand as a candidate.
Right. Let's take the conversation to the doorstep of the Defend Our Democracy civil society organization. Duduetsang, you are the communications officer for this group. This group has been very vocal against the state of the bill right now. So share with us, what is the problem with the bill as it is? Hello, Duduetsang. Well, I do not believe that we have here, but
I'm here. Sorry, I was muted. Apologies.
Right. Please go ahead if you had my question.
A couple of things that are flawed with the bill is firstly that, you know, there isn't any like new literature or analysis around whether the current proposed bill will work, and as Professor had said, whether it will foster greater accountability for the public representatives that we would elect. But also, secondly, there is no system that exists in the world that they're currently proposing, and so we can't say we're able to compare it with any other system in the world. But at the same time, as Professor had mentioned, particularly for independent candidates, what it does that it makes it extremely difficult for independent candidates to eventually win any votes, because it takes double the amount of votes for independent candidates to eventually score any seats in parliament. And we believe that that is also incredibly unfair. And so there are a couple of other things as well that are a bit problematic with it, because what it does is that it takes away the principle of one person, one vote of equal value. And we believe that, you know, given the kind of history that we have, the kind of voting systems that we had in the past before democracy, it basically justifies that if for instance, it takes an independent candidate, you know, twice the number of votes to win a seat in parliament, meaning that once they've hit the minimum threshold, the remaining votes basically become sponsored to political parties. So the competition between political parties and independent candidates is not fair. And I think these are some of the issues. But lastly, to mention that the process through which this bill was consulted through citizens of this country was also flawed. So when the Ministerial Advisory Committee released the report on the outcomes of what kind of electoral system would be best for our country, instead of taking the two views that came out as outcomes from that report, Parliament instead insisted on having public consultations only on the minority report, which only makes cosmetic changes to the bill, but does not make any meaningful changes, particularly around fostering greater accountability for public representatives when we elect them.
Let me jump in here. Professor Dirk, you know, when people talk about amendments, some of the key things they look to get in is to have a more robust inclusion into a bill, ultimately. But for some South Africans, they think that this rejigging, so to speak, amendment looks to be taking off some powers. Now, speak to us about the concerns of some South Africans who also think that this also does not meet the constitutional muster that it should get.
Well, I think what the bill is proposing, and there are sort of different versions of the bill over time that went through the parliamentary process, especially at committee stage, is that it splits the current 400 members into a 50-50 split. 50% will be the continuation of the current system, and that is the proportional representation of political parties. And the other 50%, and that means 200 of the 400 at the moment, will be so-called independent candidates. But this independent group consists of two categories. The one is truly independent candidates, and those are candidates who are not belonging to any political party. But at the same time, it can also exist of individual candidates who are nominated by political parties. And there's no specific or specification of how many of that 200 must indeed be independent, truly independent candidates who are not part of political parties at all. So it can be, and I think this is my personal sort of comment on this situation or this proposal, is it that can be that all 200 of the so-called independent candidates can actually be nominated by political parties, or all 200 can be completely independent, or any combination of them. At the same time, one of the complications which the Constitutional Court did not address at all is that our Constitution is saying, it's one of the principles of the Constitution, that the overall result of elections and representation in Parliament must still be proportional in nature. Now, for example, if all 200 of the 400 are completely independent candidates who have no alignment to any political party, then it means it isn't proportional anymore. Then the proportionality is only about 50%. The less independents there are, the more it will sort of approach proportionality. But that's a question that I think will become a constitutional question ultimately, to what extent the current or the proposed system indeed will result in still in some form, in an overall form of proportionality. The other problem, which I think is a huge problem, and that is that the country is divided into very big constituencies for this purpose. And these constituencies will be represented by more than one representative. It will be multi-member representation.
Right.
Now, in order to do that, it will require quite a lot of financial assistance for these different candidates in order to be able to campaign at all. And they will campaign against members who are nominated by political parties with infrastructure of the political parties. So in that sense, the playing field is certainly won't be level when it comes to completely independent candidates. These are a few points which I think are debated. And lastly, the system, and especially the allocation of seats of the independent candidates, is immensely technical for the general public. And most of even persons who are well informed struggle to really understand how it's going to go through different phases of allocation.
Right.
So the public in general.
We'll come back to the math of this, but Duduetsang, you mentioned that there appeared not to have been wider consultation on, putting the bill together. What would a wider consultation have done to the bill as it is now?
So, as I had mentioned earlier, the first issue with the public consultation process was that instead of taking the full outcomes of the Ministerial Advisory Committee report to the public, Parliament only chose to take the minority view for public consultation, therefore refuting the majority view, which is the preferred view by at least civil society groupings, and by virtue of that, basically making it even more the majority report, the majority view of the MAC report fosters more greater accountability for our public representatives. So if you are to take a minority view from this ministerial advisory committee, which does not favor basically what constituencies or the electorate particularly want, then what happens is that you as a result create a flawed process. And that's what civil society, or at least our civil society grouping, is complaining about, to say this process is flawed. The manner in which the consultations took place did not represent the full outcomes of the report, but only represented a minor view of the report.
Right. Now, with very little time till the deadline of the Constitutional Court, December 10 is when it gave Parliament to be able to enact this new bill. With such little time to go and a 2-year process that has gone on, my question is, why hasn't civil society take action over this period? And by action, I mean go back to the courts, perhaps.
So that's a very good question. And I think that we've tried to lobby MPs, we've tried to lobby Parliament itself, and oftentimes we've been met with hostility. We haven't been, provided with the opportunity to have meaningful engagements with Parliament. And as it stands, they've just chosen to follow their own route without, hearing what it is that civil society has to say. And so when the time is right, we may have to consider legal action and going to the courts to find recourse around this issue, particularly understanding that we are going to have elections in 2024. We need to ensure that the IEC is ready to hold these elections, and we need to ensure that we go into elections knowing that we've got an electoral system that fosters greater accountability of public representatives, ensures that independent candidates are able to compete as fairly as possible and equally to political parties.
But that's what I'm asking. When will the time be right? Would it be when the bill has probably been passed? I know civil society has been asking the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, to reject the bill and not sign it into law. But, I mean, what else will civil society be waiting for at this point?
We would have to wait for what happens tomorrow in the debates, but also wait on what the president is going to decide. And if the president decides against what it is that civil society is proposing, then we would have to institute legal action.
Right. Professor, let me bring this back to your doorstep. I mean, civil society has been trying to get the attention of Parliament, of the party, of the government for, the last 2 years, if you like. Are you surprised by how things are turning out 2 years after the Constitutional Court ruling?
It's a difficult question. A lot of work has been done by different groups. I was myself involved in some discussions within groups, which is not part of this particular civil society group, but other society groups, civil society groups. But ultimately, this is possibly one of the most key political questions in South Africa, is how the electoral system should look like. And I think the Constitutional Court gave us an indication on one particular point, and that is the inclusion of independent candidates. And there's two views. The one is that this created an opportunity to reform the whole electoral system. And the other interpretation is the more narrow one, to say it must only implement what the Constitutional Court made a judgment on. And I think this is that's sort of the debate in South Africa at the moment of what is really possible under these current conditions, whether it is a complete overhaul of the electoral system or whether it is some adjustment that will be made. At the moment, it's a bit of both. And I think that is part of the unhappiness that exists, but there's certainly differences of opinion because there's another model which goes back to 2003, the so-called Van Sou Slabbert task team that was established by government, which had another model which was also quite popular, but rejected in 2003 or just thereafter by the government. So there is a debate about the electoral systems, but to what extent it can be implemented before the 2024 election and be regarded as constitutional, I think that's still an outstanding question for us.
And Professor Kotze, let me look at some of the flaws here, because some of the key issues, but before we start to unpack or touch on some of the flaws, which is independent candidacy being one of them, how much of a concern or importance, because we still see that the democracy or politics of South Africa is still dipped in political parties' affiliation. Have there been talks of having independent candidates, apart from those who are clamoring for that to be included in this amendment?
Well, at local government level, we have, from the start in 1995, a system which is very similar to what is proposed now for the national and provincial situation. And that is that 50% of most local councils consist of ward councillors. That means individuals who represent a specific constituency or ward, and the other 50% is elected on the basis of proportional representation. So that that happened right from the start, more than 20 years ago already. And I think this provides for us some form of a test case about to what extent independent candidates will make a difference at national and provincial level. Because the political problems about not accountability are also present at local government level, despite the fact that we have independent candidates or candidates who are nominated by political parties. And incidentally, at local government level, there are actually very few completely independent representatives. The majority of them who are nominated are those nominated by political parties. So my expectation is that even if the current system that will, or the new system that will allow independent candidates might not produce as many really independent candidates as many people would like to see.
And Professor Dirk, still with you, and still looking at some of the issues here, and it has to do with the right to belong to a political party. And if you go to the clause 31B3F in the bill, it determines that one of the requirements for an independent candidate is that they should not have been a member of a political party for at least 3 months before their nomination date. Well, this seemingly, looking at the constitution of the country, violates section 19(1)(b), which guarantees the right for everyone. Is the parliament looking at this, seeming anomaly or conflict?
Well, this is one of their proposals. I myself, in my own submission that I made to Parliament, identified this as a possible unconstitutional measure. I personally believe that a person cannot be barred from being a member of any political party. It's a fundamental political right in the Constitution. And therefore, this legislation would have to look at alternative ways of determining that a person is not bound by political parties in the sense of funding by political parties and the nomination process within political parties. But to say they are not allowed to be a member of a political parties, I personally believe that will be unconstitutional.
Well, you were quoted at, I'll come back to you, Duduetsang. Let's deal with this with Professor Dirk, because he also gave an interview with The Conversation, and I'm looking at some of the figures you have given here. But quickly here, you also spoke about the proposed electoral system, which you did say may not actually go the way. Looking at the percentage of proportionality, speak to us on that. It looks like if all 200 regional seats representatives are independent, then the level of proportionality in the National Assembly will only be 50%. You want to break that down for us?
Yes, that's because that means that the total is at the moment 400. It can be between 350 and 400 according to the Constitution, but at the moment it is 400. 200 of the 400 are based on proportional representation of political parties, so that's where proportionality can be guaranteed. But the other 200 is for the so-called now independent candidates. But that can be a combination of two categories. The one category is completely independent. They don't belong to any political party. So they cannot contribute, therefore, to the proportionality. They are elected in their individual capacity. And then the other category are those individuals who can be nominated by political parties. But there's no prescription on the proportions or the quotas within the 200. So it can be anything between 0 and 200 who are completely independent, or between 0 and 200 who are all nominated by political parties. Those who are nominated by political parties can contribute ultimately because they have an association with the political party to the overall proportionality within Parliament. And that is done at local government level. And that is how the proportionality to a large extent is still incorporated in the system. But at the moment, there's nothing that in the proposed bill that addresses this matter about how that element of the Constitution will be guaranteed ultimately.
And if I were to pick up from there, the DOD has also picked issue with the fact that while political parties are supposed to present 1,000 voter signatures, the independent candidates, on the other hand, are expected to provide 8,000 voter signatures as a requirement. And the Home Affairs Minister has been reported as saying this is to sieve down and only take on serious candidates. The DOD has spoken largely about this, but share with us what are the concerns and why is this unfair to independent candidates or potential independent candidates, Duduetsang?
So simply put, it basically makes it incredibly difficult for independent candidates to eventually win any seats, because it takes it takes double the amount of votes for them to eventually get a seat into parliament, which is unfair. But also, in the event that you're an independent candidate, you've got limited resources, like the professor has been saying. It makes it doubles the amount of effort that it would take for you to compete to get a seat, whether it's in provincial legislature or parliament. And so that makes it incredibly unfair, particularly because there must be equal vote, and it must be of equal measure. And so if the minister is saying that an independent candidate must get 8,000 votes while a political party must get a fraction of, it makes that incredibly unfair. It makes it it basically makes it so difficult that it's likely that we're just going to have political parties representing us in parliament.
But when you look also at the fact that once you open up to independent candidates, surely anybody who wishes to be president or believes that they can make a change would want to put their names out there to contest for positions at the national or provincial levels. What then would be the best way to sieve out so that one, voter time is not wasted and resources of the IEC also are not wasted? What would be the options that you'll be proposing as far as the DOD is concerned?
So the thing here is to also understand that there are political parties in this country that also require a lot of sifting out, right? And and of course there's a track record for us to show that these political parties need to be sifted out because of the current situation or political recession that we find ourselves in at the current moment, or democratic recession that we find ourselves in at the current moment. And that's largely because of, how political parties have functioned, oftentimes functioning or towing the political line and not necessarily responding to the needs of constituencies or electorates or citizens. And so what we believe is that the kind of mess that we find ourselves in is as a result of political parties. And for political parties to say, or for ministers to say, we need to sift through independent candidates, it's not fair. And I think the Constitutional Court ruling on the new movement, on the new nation movement case clarified that in the event that us as electorates do not favor political parties and would rather prefer a particular candidate in a particular ward or a province, and we know that they have a track record of ethical leadership, good leadership, they've got a track record of doing community work, for instance, why can't we vote for them if that is who we prefer to vote for? So I think for me, it cannot just be a thing, an issue of we need to sift through all of these independent candidates, despite the fact that to some extent I can agree that there are going to be too many, but that should be left to the electorate to decide, not a minister.
Duduetsang, the whole idea of having independent candidates is to actually make for a robust accountability amongst those representatives of the people. But the question here now is, how does that truly impact on the grassroots democracy?
I think I think it does. The more the electorate has more options to vote for, then then that's exactly it. We want to be in a position where we've got more options to vote for outside of the political parties that we've had, because in the past we've never seen any kind of meaningful change in our democracy. And if, for instance, we are to take the risk of opting for independent candidates and seeing what it is they could offer, maybe that is something we should explore. And I think at grassroots level, we've seen how this has allowed for a different kind of politics to emerge in our communities. You're also able to hold an independent candidate directly accountable at grassroots level because you directly voted for them. And so if we could have a similar system at provincial and national level, I don't see how that creates any issues for our current electoral system, if not foster greater accountability for those that we elect, whether it is an independent candidate or a political party.
All right, Duduetsang and Professor Dirk, let's take a moment. While we come back, we'll be speaking to the issues more, with giving solutions as to how the parliament and the people can actually push to see that some of the key issues are resolved before the 2024 election. Join us again. Among the fundamental rights, responsibilities, and powers afforded to people in a democracy are the opportunity, to people in such public representatives and to stand to be elected for office. These rights are enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. But the current Electoral Amendment Bill, which is being debated in Parliament, does not meet constitutional muster. It entrenches the existing political dispensation by favoring larger political parties while disempowering independent candidates. Still with me here is Duduetsang, Mmeti, and Professor Dirk Kotze. Professor Kotze, quickly, we're trying to look at the radical changes which you also have spoken about. How important can this be brought to bear, knowing full well that the timelines are very close?
Yes, I think we are very close to, or maybe past the point of really making some extra interventions. I think, as you indicated, it will be discussed in Parliament now tomorrow in the National Assembly. It will have to be also discussed in the second house, the National Council of Provinces, and then it will most possibly be passed. I think what is the next step, so the intervention by the public at this stage is quite limited, the possibility for that. Then it must be signed by the President. If he is not sure about it, he can refer it back to Parliament, or he can ask for advice by the Constitutional Court. If it is passed and the different organizations, civil society organizations, and maybe political parties are saying that they think it is unconstitutional, it will most possibly go to the Constitutional Court. And that will be the decisive factor of what the judgment of the Constitutional Court is. One of the most important players now between, for example, the discussion in Parliament and when it maybe go to the Constitutional Court is our Independent Electoral Commission, because they must ultimately implement this new act. And the next national and provincial election is about 18 months from now. So we are at a very critical point in time that the IEC must start to be able to implement this act and prepare for that election. And I think this is the critical matter at the moment, is that there cannot be much of a delay anymore because of the pressure from the IEC that they want to have a guarantee of what they must implement as from now on until 2024.
But we still have a lot of what ifs to look at, depending on how tomorrow turns out. In the event that, further consultation is expected, on the other hand, you have the deadline of December 10 to reach. Legally, how can Parliament be able to beat or extend that deadline? Professor Kotze. Yes.
Yes, from my side, no. This is already an extension. They were supposed to have finalized it earlier this year already, and the Constitutional Court gave this extension until early in December. So I don't expect that they will be able to give another extension. It has been clear to Parliament, and I think the way in which Parliament is now moving, it's very much in view of the fact that they take that as the final date that they have to complete this process.
And if we were to go with that logic, then it would mean that we may not see the delays in the elections for South Africa in 2024, as some groups have said.
Yes, that is indeed so. We've just had now with the local government election last year in November, which was still sort of at the end of the COVID pandemic, there was the possibility of postponing elections. And the Constitutional Court ultimately did not allow it to be postponed because it would have amounted to effectively an amendment of the Constitution without Parliament's participation in that. So I don't think there's much of a likelihood for the election to be postponed, or for this legislation to be delayed so that it will cause some form of postponement. And that I think is the pressure under which both Parliament as well as the Electoral Commission is in order to conclude this process.
And Duduetsang, I know that it would seem that tomorrow is a very important day, not only for the people of South Africa, but also for CSOs as far as what action you would take is concerned. So tell us, what would tomorrow feel like for you? What are your expectations tomorrow?
So things are very uncertain for tomorrow because we don't know what or how MPs will debate and eventually vote. But I think what we have tried to do as civil society organizations is lobby MPs from smaller political parties to vote against or to reject the bill as it currently stands because of the issues that we've discussed in this conversation. And so we're hoping that through the work that we have done, it should be sufficient to allow us to see some small victory. And if we don't, then we know that there are other forms of recourse through litigation or even further lobbying and mobilization and picketing, etc., that we can do to eventually get to a point where this bill is not passed, to lobby the president as well to say this bill is not passed because it shouldn't be passed because of its flawed nature and how it doesn't foster greater accountability, but also it makes it also difficult for independent candidates to elect, to run for seats in parliament more fairly. And so that's what we hope for. And I think I just wanted to say, in addition to what the professor was saying, is that I think from our perspective, even if the bill is not the way that we would like it to be or not passed in the way that we would like it to be, it is still work that we can still do towards the 2029 elections. At some point, what we are saying is eventually electoral reform must take place because that was a promise from the Constitution. The current electoral system that we have now was negotiated to allow for the elections to happen in 1994. And so we're still in a transitionary electoral system. And so we need to get to a point where the desired electoral system that we want as South Africa must take place. And we know that, these things don't necessarily happen overnight. You have to do a whole lot of work and lobbying and consultations with constituents, but that at some point, at least the deadline must be 2029 to a point where the country has an electoral system that we think is free and fair and that allows for independent candidates to run, but also fosters greater accountability of public representatives.
Duduetsang, let me jump in here. Speaking of lobbying, one of the key things to watch out for will be heavy pressure coming from political parties on its members in parliament. Are you seeing any kind of push, or votes coming in favor of this amendment, even from party members?
Well, we
definitely.
don't see...
Oh, sorry, Professor, you can go ahead.
No, you can, please.
All right, then. Duduetsang.
So I think we've noticed a lot of pushback from the majority party, which is the ANC. But also at the same time, because the ANC is quite factionalized at the moment, we also have seen other factions of the ANC speak about how they find the bill problematic in its current form. And we know for sure that the major opposition parties have made utterances to possibly reject the bill, but we're not sure for sure. And so things are very uncertain. But I do think for us as civil society, what the work that we need to do in particular is to lobby the smaller political parties and find ways in which we can engage with the opposition parties, because as it stands, the bill may be passed because the major political party, which is the ANC, holds more seats in parliament. And that is the challenge that we have. And so, even if it's beyond the build-up of the 2024 elections, the hard work must come towards building up to the 2029 elections and ensuring that we've got an electoral system that is exactly what we want, and not something that favors political parties, particularly those who hold the majority at the moment.
And so, Professor Dirk, you can see that the numbers are not looking good in favor of this if we're to go with the party members in parliament.
Yes, that is indeed so. And I think what we have to take as reality is that none of these political parties are actually very much in favor of having too many independent candidates, because it means that they will lose seats in parliament as a result of that. So it is essentially not in their own direct self-interest that this amended act is going to give too much power to, and especially the smaller parties, because the smaller parties, if there are more independent representatives, it means that some of these smaller parties will most possibly have less support. So it's a bit of an ambivalence that exists at the moment in the way in which these parties must vote in Parliament about a dispensation which to a large extent has the potential that they can lose support in Parliament ultimately. So it is very much pressure from outside and from outside political parties, and therefore largely civil society, that will be able to ultimately produce results in this respect. And I think this is where we are because of civil society organizations that went to the Constitutional Court 2 years ago. So it is a step-by-step process, and I very much agree that I think a more realistic target actually is the period around about 2029, and that after this election, which will become in a sense, if it is implemented, the type of a test case of how this works, how to refine the process and to make it ultimately come closer to the ultimate objectives that everyone has in mind.
Right, and I just want to talk about the South African people over the next few minutes. And I'm asking this out of curiosity. Professor Kotze, share with us, is that real interest, particularly at the national level of elections, of people going independent? I can tell you, in the western part of Africa, voters are not necessarily interested in independent candidacy, particularly at the national level, unless they see that you have heavy backing, not only from themselves, but also from political parties as well. So is there real interest in South Africa with this independent candidacy, particularly at the national level?
I think that it's mixed. There's not one particular view that's dominant, and that's everyone agrees with that. I think there's some those especially with the interest in the party political system, they obviously want that to continue. While those people who are very much despondent about party politics in South Africa, and that is becoming an increasing percentage in South Africa, who don't have any more real trust in political parties or in politicians in general. As a result, the voter turnout is in decline, but it is still higher at national and provincial level than local level, where it was last year around about 48%. That means that there is an indication that the South African public is looking for alternative forms of political representation, and that the existing political parties are not necessarily being supported by the majority, because they feel that this either they, and especially the youth, the younger persons, those 35 years and younger, are not really interested in registering as candidates and therefore also participating in elections.
All right, let's wind. Professor Dirk, apologies button in. We're trying to wind down. Win or lose, this will mean something to South African democracy. Let's hear you before we come to Dirk and close. Duduetsang, what do you see happening either way this goes?
I think as Professor
go ahead, Duduetsang.
I think as the professor had said, there's a lot of voter apathy in the country, and the one thing that we want to see is an engaged citizenry, an active citizenry. And, the numbers don't lie. If you look at the voter turnout, particularly of young people, is the lowest we've ever seen in our democracy. And that says something about our trust and our belief in political parties to really push for the kinds of reforms that we want in our country, and to really, develop our country in the way that we want it to be developed. And so for me, if we can get to a point where we lobby young people, we lobby more people to vote, that would be a good thing. But also, we want to vote for something meaningful. We don't just want to vote. And so things must change in our country. We need to see the kinds of promises that were made in our constitution. We need to begin to benefit from these things. And yet we're not, and yet people continue to vote. And so that thing must change. So even if it means we go to the extent of, wanting to have an electoral system that is inclusive of independent candidates in the hope that we could see change, maybe that it is what we should try.
Okay, let's bring in Professor Dirk. Final word from you, Professor Dirk. What kind of change do you expect to see at the end of this journey or battle?
Well, I think given what we have at the moment in terms of the constitutional framework, it will have to be a hybrid system, a combination of political parties with proportional representation, and then an arrangement, which I think we are now working on, of how to bring in individual candidates, whether it is independents or those nominated by political parties. That combination, I think that's the mix that deserves more attention, I would say, in future. And then the other big problem, I would say, is that the constituencies that they are going to represent are far too big. At the moment, it's the same, or the proposal is that they are the same as the 9 provinces. And a province like Gauteng, for example, have more than 15 million people. So how are you going to campaign as an independent in such a very populist type of situation? Or another province, which is the Northern Cape, which only have 4% of the population, but is almost 30% of the geography of South Africa. Again, it is very difficult for independent individual candidates to be able to campaign there. And it's for multi-member constituencies, which we have absolutely no experience about, which means also that accountability of the individual representatives will still be difficult to enforce ultimately. So we are in an experimental phase, I would say, of coming to a point where we hopefully will have a better represented as well as a more accountable system.
Well, an interesting development in South African politics. Professor Dirk, Kotze and Duduetsang Mmeti, many thanks for being such nice company on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And to our viewers across Africa and the rest of the world, many thanks for watching. I'm Sulaiman.
And I'm Mmeti. I'm going to have a good evening. Bye-bye.